What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
If you ever want to know who owns the room, wait for the second before a toast, when the champagne glasses lift, but the words have not yet been spoken, because whoever smiles first is the person who believes the next 10 minutes belong to them. On the night of my engagement party, I watched my sister smile before the clinking had even started, her hand brushing across her stomach like a magician palming a coin, and with a perfectly timed pause that felt rehearsed, she declared she had her own announcement. The restaurant had been humming with the warmth of low golden light, the kind that makes every glass sparkle and every guest look like they belong on the front of a holiday card. But the moment Claire opened her mouth, it was as if the glow tilted entirely in her direction. She announced she was pregnant, and the room erupted in laughter and applause as though this were the finale of a sitcom and she had just delivered the closing punchline. My mother gasped so loudly that people at nearby tables turned to look, while Daniel, my fiancé, slid his hand onto my thigh and gripped hard enough to leave little crescents from my ring pressing into my skin. He didn't say a word, but I could read the silent message in the way his jaw locked and his temple pulsed. Not tonight. But it was too late. Tonight had already been stolen. Claire, in her cream sweater that almost blended into the tablecloth, smirked at me with that familiar look I had seen my entire life, the look of someone who believes that every family gathering is her personal stage. And the worst part was that the crowd rewarded her, clapping and laughing like she had delivered a gift rather than yanked the spotlight out of my hands. I didn't stand up or protest because I knew better than to look like the bitter sister, the one who couldn't celebrate someone else's joy. Instead, I tapped my glass lightly with my fork, smiled just wide enough for the cameras that were already pointing in our direction, and suggested that we take 2 photos, one of the couple we were all here to celebrate and one of the couple who had given us a bonus reason to toast. It was a line dressed up as generosity, but the laughter that followed leaned back toward me, and for a fleeting moment, I had the sense that I had stolen the mic back, if only for a single beat. Later that night, after hugs had been exchanged and the last of the desserts boxed up to go, I posted the photo in the family group chat with a caption that said, "2 happy announcements in one night, not bad for a Thursday." It was breezy, neutral, the kind of message that no one could accuse of bitterness, but beneath it lay a reminder. This was still my night, and tomorrow, everyone would see the official save the date we had spent weeks perfecting. Claire, of course, couldn't let it go, leaning over at the restaurant to whisper that she hoped our wedding colors wouldn't clash with her bump. I laughed in that deliberate way that lets someone know you heard them but didn't find it funny, then excused myself to circulate among the guests. By the time Daniel and I collapsed into bed, exhausted and hollowed out by the evening, my phone buzzed with a notification. An aunt had already posted Claire's announcement photo in the group chat with the caption, "Some girls just can't help stealing the show." The laughing emojis piled up, and though someone added a half-hearted string of hearts for us, it felt like an afterthought, like a consolation prize for the couple who had technically hosted the evening but hadn't truly owned it. I flipped my phone face down on the nightstand, stared at the ceiling until my eyes burned, and thought about how joy in our family always seemed to function like a limited resource. Whoever grabbed first got the largest share. By morning, I was done waiting for someone else to hand me back what was mine. I sat at the kitchen table, hair still tangled from sleep, and drafted the new save the date. It was simple, elegant, and unmistakably ours, with one carefully chosen line on the website that would be impossible to miss. "Please, no surprise announcements during wedding events. If you love us, let the day be ours." It was a boundary disguised as a joke, a velvet rope stretched across the entrance to my future. By noon, the design was finished. By late afternoon, my mother had already left me a chirpy voicemail about how thrilled she was to share it with the cousins. And by early evening, just as I was pouring wine and telling myself I could finally exhale, my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. The voicemail was short, syrupy, and sickly sweet, the kind of tone my sister uses when she's about to wedge herself into a space that doesn't belong to her. She had called Daniel directly, not me, and in the message she told him there were things he deserved to know about me, delivered with the fake warmth of someone handing you a gift that will burn your hands the second you unwrap it. That night, before I pressed play, I knew with a cold certainty what she was doing. Claire hadn't just stolen my party. Now, she wanted to steal my fiancé's trust. I pressed my finger against the screen, listened as her voice filled the room, and felt the quiet shift of something dangerous settling into place. The party had been hers, but the next move would be mine. The morning after the party tasted like flat champagne and cold resolve, the kind of clarity you get when the adrenaline has burned off and the only thing left is the decision not to play dumb anymore, so I opened my laptop, queued up the wedding website I had babied for weeks, and rebuilt the front page around a single idea that felt both petty and necessary. The day would belong to us, and if anyone felt compelled to stage a personal press conference, they could do it under their own banner, on their own time, with their own catering bill. I kept the design clean and grown-up, cream background, spare typography, a tiny theater spotlight icon shining on our initials, then added the RSVP flow Daniel and I had joked about but never planned to use, a friendly little questionnaire that, after the usual meal options and song requests, asked guests whether they were planning any surprise announcements during wedding events, with choices that read no, absolutely not, and I will be stopped by security, which made Daniel laugh out loud because sometimes the only polite way to say back off is to let people laugh while they read the word no. I hit publish at 4 in the afternoon and sent the save the date to our list with a short note that sounded like us, warm, practical, not affected, then watched the confirmations begin to blink in, the green checkmark stacking like proof that real life would, in fact, move forward without my sister narrating it. 5 minutes later, Claire's text landed with the soft violence of a velvet hammer, a screenshot of the date with a neat row of question marks that looked like teeth, followed by a breathless accusation that we had intentionally chosen the same Saturday she had earmarked for her gender reveal brunch, which, according to her, the entire family had already mentally committed to, as though thoughts could reserve a banquet hall. I told her, calmly, because rage might be cathartic but it rarely changes anything, that our venue deposit had been placed months ago, that flights for Daniel's parents were already booked, and that she could host her brunch on Sunday, which I would attend, with a gift basket so cute it would practically coo, but that I would not be moving my wedding weekend the way a person moves a dentist appointment, and if she had a problem, she could take it up with the calendar and the concept of time. She did not text back words so much as she detonated innuendo, forwarding the voicemail she had left for Daniel the night before, the one where her voice wove concern into sabotage like ribbon through a wreath, telling him there were things he deserved to know about me and my temper, and how I shut down when I feel overshadowed, slyly positioning herself as the translator of my alleged storms. Daniel listened, looked at me with a precision that steadied my spine, and suggested we call her together, because triangulation is a game that only works if you agree to play. When she picked up, her tone was sugar on a hot skillet, sweet until it scorched, so I thanked her for her concern, told her we would be addressing any questions as a pair, and asked directly what, exactly, Daniel deserved to know. She pivoted into a monologue about family stress and how a wedding should not divide siblings, and how she worried my cool exterior might hide sharp edges, which would have been almost flattering if it were not so obviously designed to make him wonder what I sounded like when the door closed. Daniel thanked her, said our wedding planning was a two-person conversation, and ended the call with a politeness that felt like a door clicking gently but firmly into its frame. I took the next hour to do something that looked a lot like revenge and a lot like adulthood. I logged into our vendor portals and added a simple, infuriatingly effective rule to every contract and timeline: no changes without the couple's shared passphrase, which was a ridiculous inside joke that no one could guess, then emailed the entire vendor team with a courteous memo that any relative, friend, or alleged spokesperson trying to move dates, times, or quantities should be thanked and refused unless they could produce that passphrase on the spot. It felt like slipping a deadbolt into place, not because I was sure Claire would try something, but because I had finally learned she only respects walls when they are load-bearing. For dessert, I added a small feature to the website, a public pledge wall, where guests could tick a box that read, "I promise not to make personal announcements during wedding events," which emailed them an automatic thank you and, to my private delight, displayed their names in a tidy list under the header, "Let the day be the day." Within an hour, Daniel's mother, my old boss, 2 college friends, and our florist had signed, and watching those names stack up did something medicinal to my breathing. By evening, the save the date had completed its orbit through the cousins and work friends and Chicago people we see once a year, and my phone was calm enough that I allowed myself to imagine we might ride the wave into a quieter week. Then a new text from Claire arrived with a single line that read, "If you wanted to compete, you could have just said so," followed by a link to a baby registry set to private, as if to remind me that she would never stop mistaking boundaries for warfare. I poured tea I knew I would not finish, drafted a response that was equal parts kind and unbendable, and about to hit send when an unfamiliar email name popped into my inbox. The subject line bland and corporate in a way that made my stomach drop faster than any exclamation point could. "Requested change to your event." I opened it and saw the venue manager's polite message referencing, "Your sister's call this afternoon regarding a necessary adjustment to timing due to a family situation," along with a note asking me to confirm whether I approved moving our rehearsal block to an earlier slot that would make Daniel's parents' flight impossible to catch. I stared at the screen long enough to feel heat behind my eyes, then forwarded the email to Daniel and typed the passphrase in the reply box so fast my fingers stuttered. I did not send rage, and I did not send panic. I sent the memo we had already drafted to cover exactly this kind of stunt: professional, chilled to the perfect temperature, and unambiguous, thanking the manager for their diligence, declining any changes without the passphrase, and asking them to document the caller's name for our records, which is the sort of sentence that makes people sit up straighter even through a screen. It was petty only in that it worked. When I hit send, my phone buzzed again, this time with a short, clipped text from my father that read, "Call me tonight. There's something you need to hear about your sister's announcement," which landed with a weight I felt in my throat, because I could not tell if he meant gossip, crisis, or the kind of family truth that loosens the hinges on the story you have been telling yourself for years. When my father called that night, his voice carried the kind of tension you only hear in someone who knows they are about to step onto a landmine and can't decide whether to keep walking or hold their breath. He told me that Claire's announcement hadn't been the fairy tale surprise it looked like in front of the guests. He said there had been whispers in the family for weeks, speculation about whether she had rushed it for reasons no one could pin down, and that a few relatives had even asked if the timing had been deliberate, chosen specifically to collide with my engagement. He didn't say it in so many words, but the silence that followed suggested he believed the answer was yes, and that his only role was to pass along the warning like a man sliding a note across a table in a dark cafe. I thanked him, told him I already suspected as much, and hung up with the uneasy sense that my sister had crossed a threshold she would not be able to walk back over gracefully. The following weekend, my mother insisted we host a family brunch to smooth things over, which, in practice, meant she wanted me to sit in a room with my sister and pretend we were playing some sanitized version of Harmony for the benefit of the aunts and cousins who thrived on performance. I agreed, but on my terms. That morning, while setting the table, I placed a large glass jar in the center, slipped a folded piece of paper inside it, and taped a handwritten label across the front that read, "No Surprise Announcements Fund." The rule was simple. Anyone who tried to hijack the occasion with personal news had to drop $50 into the jar, which would then be donated to charity. It was playful enough to look like a joke, but blunt enough to function as a razor. When Daniel saw it, he smirked into his coffee and whispered that he hoped someone tested it. Predictably, someone did. Claire arrived in a pale pink blouse that looked calculated to whisper maternal glow, placed both hands under her stomach as she walked through the door, and within minutes of sitting down, announced loudly to the table that she had been dying to tell everyone about the names she and Mark were considering. The room, already buzzing with chatter, went still for a moment, eyes sliding between me, the jar, and my sister's face. I didn't move first. Daniel reached for his wallet, pulled out a crisp bill, and set it gently on the table beside the jar. He didn't say a word, but the meaning was clear. The relatives burst into nervous laughter, and after a long, theatrical sigh, Claire fished into her designer bag, produced some folded bills, and shoved them into the jar with a smile so strained it looked like it might crack her skin. The moment was over in less than a minute, but the symbolism clung to the air like perfume. This time, her spotlight came with a price tag. I let her sit with it, pretending to return to my eggs, when my phone buzzed with an email notification from the venue. My breath caught as I read the first lines. A request had been logged that morning to explore alternate weekend availability due to a family medical situation. Attached was the name of the requester, Claire. She had called the venue directly, claimed an emergency, and tried to maneuver my date onto a different weekend, which would have unraveled months of planning and deposits. I pushed my plate away, leaned toward Daniel, and showed him the screen. His face went flat with the kind of anger that isn't loud but cold, the kind that builds when you realize someone isn't just playing dirty, they're building an entire strategy around it. I excused myself from the table under the pretense of checking in with a vendor and stepped into the hallway, typing furiously. My email to the venue was short, professional, and unyielding. Thank you for your diligence. No changes are to be made without our joint written approval. Please disregard any requests from third parties, and kindly note for our records who placed the call. I hit send with a satisfaction that ran deeper than pettiness. This wasn't just a clapback. It was the formalization of a wall. When I returned to the table, Claire was laughing with my mother, trying to reassert control with her practiced charm, but I noticed the jar still sitting between us, bills visible through the glass, like a reminder that she no longer moved through our gatherings unchecked. Brunch went on with strained small talk and forced smiles, yet beneath the surface I felt the tectonic plates shifting. The family had watched her pay for her performance, and they had watched me decline to look flustered. But the satisfaction was fleeting. That evening, as Daniel and I stacked dishes and replayed the day in our heads, my inbox pinged again, this time with a forwarded email from our photographer. It contained a copy of a message Claire had sent them directly, phrased innocently but dripping with intent, asking if they were available to photograph a private family event on the same date as our wedding, and if so, whether they might be willing to shuffle our contract to accommodate it. I sat frozen at the counter, staring at the screen, the laughter from brunch still echoing faintly in my ears, realizing that my sister had escalated past petty interruptions and was now attempting to dismantle my wedding piece by piece, as if the ceremony itself were simply another stage for her to occupy. The forwarded email from our photographer sat on my screen like a bruise I kept pressing, a short, chirpy note from Claire asking whether they might be flexible for a very special family moment, with the same date as our wedding listed like a dare, and a final sentence that pretended to be considerate while hinting at urgency, as if circumstances beyond anyone's control required my vendors to pivot around her orbit. I stared at it long enough for the kettle to wail itself quiet, then opened the shared drive where every contract, timeline, and invoice lived in tidy folders labeled with the kind of precision I had once worried made me look uptight. It turns out that being organized is not the enemy of joy. It is the only reason joy survives other people's chaos. I pulled the photographer's contract, highlighted the non-transferability clause and the cancellation penalties, and drafted a calm, almost friendly reply that thanked them for flagging the request, reaffirmed our date and exclusivity, and attached the clause with the kind of cheerful formality that says I do not raise my voice because I do not need to. I CC'd Daniel, blind copied the planner, and in a separate thread sent the photographer a small bonus and a note about how much we valued their professionalism, because receipts are not just paperwork, they are loyalty written in numbers. That set the tone for the rest of the morning, which I spent fortifying the walls without announcing a siege. I added a single-page vendor communications policy to our portal that required all schedule or scope requests to come only from me or Daniel, included the passphrase protocol, and asked anyone who received a conflicting instruction to forward it to us with the subject line "External Change Attempt," which sounds dull until you see it in a crowded inbox and feel the cold clarity of a system working. The planner responded within minutes with a bright on it, attached a template she uses for celebrity clients dealing with over-helpful relatives, and scheduled courtesy check-ins with every vendor for midweek, which meant if anyone tried a second end run, we would catch it before it reached the field. Only then did I call my mother, because I have learned that when facts are clean and documented, emotion has less room to take up space, and I walked her through exactly what had happened: the rehearsal block that almost moved, the venue's logged call, the photographer's email, and the fact that I was not imagining a campaign so much as responding to one. She went quiet in the way she does when she wants to defend the indefensible, but cannot find a sentence that survives daylight, then asked me to keep the peace, because my grandmother worried the family would split into teams. I told her peace is not a room where one person rearranges the furniture and calls it compromise, and that I was done pretending staying silent was the mature option. She inhaled, exhaled, and asked me to come to dinner that night, because we should talk like adults, which in our house often meant that the person asking you to be adult wanted you to fold first. We went, because I have learned you cannot insist on boundaries and then avoid eye contact. Daniel drove, one hand steady on the wheel, and reminded me that we were a team, not contestants on a show my sister produced. At the table, my father passed the salad with unusual ceremony. My mother over-explained the roast chicken as if it might negotiate for her, and Claire arrived late, laughing at a message on her phone, then placed it face up by her plate like a small mirror catching the light. I did not bring up the photographer, because escalation can be a trap, but the planner's mid-afternoon email had already done the work for me. Our florist forwarded a transcript of a call Claire had made under the guise of checking stem counts, and the subject line on the forward, external change attempt, glowed in my pocket like a reminder not to doubt myself. I waited for the right opening, which arrived when my mother said she hoped everyone would rally around 2 celebrations without turning this into a scoreboard, and I told them I agreed completely. Which is why we had implemented a simple communications policy to protect both events from misfires, then slid printed copies across the table the way a manager slides an agenda at the start of a meeting. The policy was 1 page, printed on harmless cream paper, easy font, bullet points that did not accuse anyone by name, but the room changed the moment Claire recognized the implication. Her cheeks went blotchy under the good makeup, and she said she felt policed, a word that landed with the drama she intended. Daniel spoke first, bless him, explaining that guardrails are not punishments, they are the only reason a highway works, and that we welcomed her joy the same way we welcomed any sanity-preserving rule that kept the wheels attached. For revenge, measured, elegant, and completely above board, I did something that made Claire's reflex to claim center stage work against her. I opened my phone, projected the screen to my parents' television with a tap, and walked everyone through the pledge wall on our website that guests had started signing, a cheerful grid of names under the header "Let the day be the day," then read a few of the notes out loud, including one from my aunt who had that sharp caption the night of the party but apparently found our boundary refreshing. It was not a drag, it was a mirror, and watching my mother's expression soften as she scrolled the names did more to shift the energy in the room than any argument I could have won. Claire tried one last maneuver, announcing that she and Mark were considering moving out of state for his job before the baby arrived, and that it would make scheduling delicate, which she framed as a plea for understanding, but tasted like a threat made of logistics. My father cleared his throat, put his fork down with care, and said there was something we should all hear before this turned into a war of calendars. He said the timing of the announcement had not been dictated by joy alone, that there were medical notes and a doctor's caution about viability in the earliest weeks, and that, in his words, the spectacle was a way to outrun the fear, which sounded generously phrased and suspiciously rehearsed, and left me suspended between empathy and the familiar impulse to check the door locks. I looked at Claire, who held my gaze with a steadiness I recognized from childhood competitions where she believed that if she did not blink first she had not lost, and I realized I did not know whether my anger was aimed at her cruelty or her panic, or both. And that either way I could not plan a wedding inside a fog of unspoken things. I told my parents we loved them, we wanted kindness for everyone, and we would proceed with our wedding as planned with the policies in place, then stood up to leave, because sometimes the only adult thing to do is end the meeting on time. In the driveway, as Daniel unlocked the car, my phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number that turned out to be Mark's, a single line that read, "Please call me tonight. There's something about the announcement you haven't been told." And suddenly the neat stack of receipts in my bag felt like evidence for a case I did not yet understand. Mark's message sat in my inbox like a weight I didn't know how to carry, a single line asking me to call him because there was something about Claire's announcement that I hadn't been told, and for a long moment I just stared at it, wondering whether opening the door to his voice would make me complicit in a betrayal I wasn't sure I wanted to touch. Daniel urged me to call, his hand on mine steady and patient, and I did, bracing myself for the sort of half-truths that usually come when someone is speaking both for themselves and for the person they live beside. His voice was low, rushed, almost apologetic, and he told me that the pregnancy wasn't unfolding the way the family believed. There had been complications, there had been panic. And there had been a conversation between him and Claire about how securing attention quickly might serve as a buffer against fear, because if everyone celebrated loudly enough, maybe no one would notice the silence of what they were most afraid to say. He insisted that while her timing looked cruel, it was also desperate, and that I needed to know she wasn't only trying to hurt me, she was trying to outrun something that was already chasing her. I listened, nodded at words he couldn't see, and when I hung up I found myself pacing the kitchen with the kind of restless energy that comes when you're torn between empathy and fury. Was I supposed to forgive the sabotage, the calls to vendors, the email trails and whispered warnings, just because fear was tangled into it? Or was the truth that fear and cruelty can live in the same body, and one doesn't excuse the other, it only explains it? I poured wine, didn't drink it, and finally sat down to draft what I thought would be my last move in this exhausting game. It was not an email, and it was not another clause added to a contract. It was a new save-the-date, final, polished, designed with the kind of restraint that speaks louder than any slogan. Across the bottom of the card, in small script, we placed a line that looked like decoration but wasn't. "This day belongs to us, and we can't wait to share it with you." No jokes, no barbs, just a quiet certainty that left no space for interpretation. The cards went out the following morning, and within hours my phone buzzed with the fallout. Friends sent laughing texts about the elegance of it, relatives forwarded screenshots of the RSVP page, and my mother called to say she thought it was classy, which is her highest form of praise. But then came Claire's reaction, not through her voice, but through the silence of her absence. No text, no call, no jab, just a sudden quiet that was almost more unnerving than her constant smirk. By evening, my inbox carried only one new message from her, a forwarded link to her private baby registry, stripped of commentary. As though she wanted me to see the list of items she had chosen and draw my own conclusions about whether she expected me to be generous in spite of everything. I didn't reply, because sometimes silence is the only line you can hold without cracking. The wedding crept closer, and though the sabotage slowed, the atmosphere in the family remained taut, stretched between my insistence on boundaries and her refusal to admit she had crossed them. When Daniel and I rehearsed our vows in the living room, tripping over words that suddenly felt heavier than the paper they were printed on, I realized the revenge I had thought I wanted, the clever clapbacks, the pointed policies. The little jars and public pledges had never been the point. What mattered was that the day itself arrive intact, that the moment when I walked down the aisle not be framed by anyone else's need to be noticed, and that Daniel's face be the only anchor in the room. The night before the ceremony, my father pulled me aside in the backyard, under the faded string lights that had been hanging since the last graduation party, and said softly that Claire had chosen not to attend. He tried to make it sound like a choice she had made for her own well-being, but the way his eyes moved told me it was also a punishment, a withdrawal meant to leave a hole I would feel even as I said my vows. I stood there in the shadows, torn between relief that the spotlight thief would not get another chance to perform, and sorrow that my family would sit divided on the day I had hoped might unite us, even for an hour. The wedding day itself was everything I had wanted it to be, quietly beautiful, filled with faces that looked at us rather than over our shoulders, laughter that belonged to the moment and not to a performance, and a dinner that tasted like peace. And yet, as I stood with Daniel on the dance floor, watching the reflection of the chandelier in his eyes, I thought about the empty chair that bore her absence, about the jar still half full of bills tucked away in our kitchen, about the receipts and contracts that testified to a battle no one had officially declared. I wondered whether I had won anything at all, or whether I had simply refused to lose, and if the difference between those two things mattered. When we left for our honeymoon, I checked my phone one last time before shutting it off, and there it was, a message from Claire, sent at 2 in the morning, a single line that read, "One day you'll see it wasn't just about you." I didn't reply, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew the power of leaving a question unanswered, of letting the silence linger longer than the smirk ever could. And even now, when I think back on that night, I don't know whether her words were an excuse, a confession, or a warning about the kind of rivalry that never really ends.